of course, while they're in prison, they can't vote. But even when they've done their time and everything, they still can't vote for a short period of time. So I have a quote from an article titled "Estimates of People Denied Voting Rights Due to a Felony Conviction." Excuse me. 1 out of 44 adults, which is 2.27% of the total U.S. voting eligible population, is disenfranchised due to a current or previous felony conviction. So that's a good amount of people that can't vote because of a felony conviction. Another problem is felons are losing their rights to vote because of issues like not paying what they owe for when they had their felony. I have another quote from the same article that says, "We estimate that nearly 900,000 people who have completed their sentences remain disenfranchised despite a 2018 ballot referendum that promised to restore their voting rights. Florida thus remains the nation's disenfranchisement leader in absolute numbers, with over 1.1 million people currently banned from voting, often because they cannot afford to pay court-ordered statements, or because the statement is not obligated to tell them the amount of their amount." So that's saying that felons can't vote because they haven't paid their court. They owe the court money because they're felons and they can't pay it. And there's also been situations where the court just is, backed up from cases and stuff, so they don't even know how much they owe. So them waiting to know how much they owe, they still can't vote during that process, which causes, their rights to be taken away. The problem is caused by people mainly being closed-minded, not accepting people for making mistakes. I know a man that was in jail and out of jail throughout his young life and kind of adult life. He got mixed up into some bad situations with bad people and made mistakes. He paid for those mistakes by going to jail, and he was also living homeless for a while. He one day decided to turn his life around, and he went to rehab and worked really hard on himself. He is now happily married, has 2 children, a nice house, and a nice job. He's also 32 years sober from drugs and alcohol. And this man I'm talking about is my dad. For his whole life, he has not been able to vote due to the mistakes he made 32 years ago that he has done time for and has learned. And I mean, of course, he's my dad, so I think probably differently than others, but I think he's learned. Like, he has a great life now. He's stayed away from the mistakes he did back then because his mistakes were with drugs. And he's been 32 years sober, and he still can't vote because he was a felon back when he was 20. Taking someone's right to vote away is taking away their freedom. A quote from an article titled "Protect Our Voting Rights" states, "Every election, voters face discriminatory laws, needless barriers, and dirty tricks throughout their journey to the ballot box. As a result, thousands of eligible Americans are denied a fair say in our democracy. Taking away rights will cause more rights to be taken away slowly, and eventually we'll have no more rights." So by taking felons' rights away for voting, that just kind of okays that we can start taking more rights away from voting, and that can cause a more bigger issue in the future, and that just takes away from the Voting Right Act that we went through. We should fix this problem because a majority of felons have made mistakes and have learned from them. By not letting them vote, we're basically telling them that they're not one of us and punishing them more even when they serve their time. A quote from an article titled "Eric Holder Makes Case for Felons to Get Voting Rights Back" states, in a speech at Georgetown University Law Center, Holder said, "It is time to fundamentally reconsider laws that permanently disfranchise people who are no longer under federal or state supervision." Holder said that the current laws forbidding felons from voting make it harder for them to come back into society. He pointed to a recent study that showed that felons in Florida who were granted the right to vote again and a lower reconviction rate. These restrictions are not only unnecessary and unjust, they are also not right, Holder said. By getting rid of this and isolating imposed people and individuals, these laws increase the likelihood they will commit future crimes. So by not letting them back into society and basically saying we don't trust them for the rest of their lives is wrong because they could also lash out, and that's what kind of makes felons in the beginning, is being excluded or neglected. So yeah, they're bottom line is they're human beings, and they should, like, we want citizens to vote, and they are citizens at the end of the day, and they should be able to vote.
Okay, so now the negative cross. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you think that regardless of how intense the crime that has been committed was, that they should still have the opportunity to vote, or do you think it should be to a certain extent?
I believe that eventually they should be able to vote. Maybe they should get their, I think while they're in prison and such, I don't think that they should have the right to vote, but while they're out of prison and done their time for whatever they did, which would be like any time not in prison or anything like that, I think that they should be able to vote.
Okay. And then because not everybody has the right to vote, such as children, non-citizens, and the mentally incompetent, how could we say that those who have committed high crimes should be above others?
Because basically saying that they're untrustworthy, kind of like children, not that children have issues, but it's just because they're children. Felons still get more, they still get rights when they're out of prison. Like, they can still get married, they can still buy alcohol, they can still do all these things except really vote. And that's what I think is wrong, because why can they have all these rights? And also, if they were really untrustworthy, why are we letting them out of prison to begin with?
Okay. And then, so you talked a little bit about how how some felons, I guess, once they're out of prison, or they can't, I forgot exactly what you said, but about not affording to pay their dues. Mm-hmm. So are you saying that they should still be able to vote even if they haven't paid their fines and everything?
Yes, that gets a little tricky because that is still technically their punishment, but what I was saying with that is some of their dues are really, really expensive to where they probably won't even be able to pay it the rest of their life. Mm-hmm. But I guess that does go with what they did, but the main reason that I said that was because sometimes courts, you can't get a court date for a year. So if they can't get that court date for the year of the election, that means they can't vote, which I think is unfair to them.
Okay. Was that 2 minutes, or should I ask another?
Yeah, that was good. That was good.
Okay. All right. So, a felony is considered a crime of high seriousness, and people who commit such serious crimes have specifically shown that they are not trustworthy, and where their privileges must be reevaluated. Sorry, I didn't start the time. So I'll be arguing reasons as to why the United States should not recognize felon voting rights. If they are not if they're not willing to follow the law, then they should not have a role in making a law for anyone else. Restrictions are consistent with other voting limitations such as age, residency, sanity, and other felon restrictions such as no guns for violent offenders and no sex offenders near schools. According to the NCSL in 2021, in 3 states, felons never lose the right to vote, while in 19 states, felons lose their voting rights only while incarcerated and receive automatic restoration upon release. In 18 states, felons lose their voting rights during incarceration and for a period of time after, typically while on parole and or probation. Voting rights are automatically restored after this time period, and former felons may also have to pay fines, fees, or restitution before their rights are restored as well. And then lastly, in 11 states, felons lose their voting rights indefinitely for some crimes or require a governor's pardon in order for voting rights to be restored. And they face an additional waiting period after completion of the sentence or require additional action before voting rights can be restored. In an article by Hans von Spakovsky, he wrote, as a federal judge said in 2002 in an unsuccessful case challenging Florida's disenfranchisement law, felons are deprived of their ability to vote because of their own decision to commit an act for which they assume the risks of detection and punishment. So basically, these felons made a decision ultimately that would greatly impact their lives in a variety of ways. And so it's only fair that they would have to lose certain rights, or else they won't really learn from their poor actions, I guess. And as stated in the quote, I guess they should assume risks of punishment after committing an act of felony. And then in an article by Rick Scott in 2011, he wrote, the restoration of civil rights can be a significant part of the rehabilitation of criminal offenders and can assist them in re-entry into society. It is important that this form of clemency be granted in a deliberate, thoughtful manner that prioritizes public safety and creates incentives to avoid criminal activity. So we must prioritize public safety before ensuring and allowing felons rights, such as the right to vote. And we also find it necessary to have certain punishments other than just jail time in order for these individuals to really learn that the crimes they have committed are unjust. In an article from Rob McKenna and Sam Reed in 2006, they wrote, we believe a rational basis does exist for the legislator to deny felons the right to vote until they have completed their entire court-ordered sentences, including payment of criminal penalties, victims' restitution, and court-ordered sentences, including payment of criminal penalties, victims' restitution, and legal fees, rather than separating out various sentencing aspects. So this is the argument pertaining to voting before fines and restitutions is paid. So this is not to say that we don't want those convicted of felonies to never re-engage with society, but it does take time, and you have to look at the different circumstances before just ensuring that right to them. And they should also be more focused, I guess, on working on themselves and recovery before just automatically focusing on getting those rights back, I guess. Next, an article from Ashton Gurgen. She wrote, we cannot be sure as a society that we can trust them to act in ways that respect and represent society because they have already proved that they cannot be trusted. Felons commit crimes that involve an injustice to another party as well as the entire society. There are consequences for those that commit crimes that violate the rights of others. So again, it just goes back to the way that we represent society and show what is right and wrong, and just the whole consequences, I guess. And then lastly, for the plan, in an article by Spakovsky and Clegg in 2018, they wrote, but it is precisely because such a high percentage of criminals who are released are so unimproved that they find their way back into prison, which is nationally more than half, that it makes sense to wait a period of time, as Florida does, to make sure that the felon really has turned over a new leaf. After that period of time, how long would depend on the crime committed, whether they had previous felonies, how long ago the crimes were committed, and what the felon has done since being released. Then the felon could have the right to vote restored. So basically, we found that felons, even when they're released, they might not have succeeded with the proper improvements, and they're continuing to commit more crimes. So it seems plausible to allow a certain amount of time that might differ from case to case before restoring all their rights. And yeah, there's just certain requirements to be looked at before those rights are restored. I think that was 6 minutes. So.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So I'll ask you some questions. In your opinion, do you think all felons are bad people for the rest of their life, or do you think that they can change?
I think they can definitely change, and I would never say that they're bad people. I think on this case, it's just more about helping them realize that obviously what they have done is wrong, and that's not to say that they can't ever change or um, yeah, I think a lot of them do change, and having proper consequences and stuff kind of allows for that realization. But yeah, I guess in pertaining to voting rights, it's just allowing for time and making sure that they can realize that what they've done is wrong, I guess.
Mhm.
But never to say that they're bad people or anything.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Okay. Does it make a difference to you if someone went to jail only once or more than once?
Yeah, I think that is kind of a part of it when I was talking about like the plan to kind of like look into their background and see um, if they have changed or not. Because in one of the sources that I found, like nationally, more than half when they were released, they were unimproved and they would end up back in prison. So it does happen quite often, and I think that would kind of have a little bit of an effect on if they would have the right to vote or not, I guess.
Hmm. Okay. And do you believe all people in jail are guilty? So, like, for example, there's been multiple cases that like people have been in prison for years when they found guilty later. So, what do you think about that? So it's like they've been in prison, they can't like vote because they were like,
Yeah. Well, that's a tricky situation because I guess they would have gotten themselves into some sort of situation that um, caused them to get them to that point, but that is unfortunate. I don't know. I
mhm,
don't know exactly what I would say. That's just kind of an unfair disadvantage to them, and I don't think that's exactly right. But I
mhm,
guess it would depend on the situation and what exactly occurred.
mhm.
But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So
Mhm.
I'll talk a little bit about some quotes I've found. So, a rebuttal to prisoners being untrustworthy. I found a quote from an article titled "Too Many Ex-Convicts Aren't Able to Vote" by Steve Chapman. And Mr. Chapman says, "We let ex-convicts marry, reproduce, buy beer, own property, and drive. They don't lose their freedom of religion, their right against self-incrimination, or their right to not have soldiers in their homes," which is kind of outdated. But in many places, the assumption is that they can't be trusted to help choose our leaders. If we thought criminals could never be reformed, we wouldn't let them out of prison in the first place. So this quote's just talking about how the bottom line for most people that don't want felons to vote is that they can be untrustworthy because they did break the law, and they obviously don't want people to help create laws if they're breaking them, which is fair when they're in prison and they're dealing with their stuff they need to do and stuff. But once they're out of prison, they should give that chance. They should get that chance again to come back into society and vote if we're giving them all these other rights they can do. Um, Another thing I noticed is that for voting rights, for the Voting Rights Act back in the day when we wanted like voting rights, we wanted voting rights for all citizens. So at the end of the day, the only people that really shouldn't be getting voting rights would be non-citizens, because as long as you're a citizen of the United States, you shouldn't have an issue. A quote from the ballotpedia.org says, if we're serious about calling ourselves a democracy, we must firmly establish that the right to vote is a universal principle that applies to all American citizens 18 years and older. As American citizens, all of us are entitled to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and all of the other freedoms enshrined in our Bill of Rights. We're also entitled to vote. At a time when voting suppression is taking place all across the country, we must make it clear that casting a ballot for American citizens is not a privilege, it is a right. If you're an American citizen who's 18 years or older, you must be able to vote whether you're in jail or not. So then jail part, I'm I agree that they should not be voting while in jail. But when they get out, I don't see an issue with it. And the only time I would see a really big issue with it is if they've haven't improved like throughout many, many years. Then yeah, maybe we should not let them vote. But if they've just, if, like example, like the story with my dad, like he was in and out of jail for a couple years when he was younger, but he's 32. He's been 32 years out of jail and everything. And I feel like people like that deserve a right to vote and just to give them a chance. And yeah, I can let you go now.
Okay, there it is, clean. Okay, so I guess in response to people being entitled to freedom, different freedoms, and entitled to different rights, I would agree that that is true, but we also have to understand that there's many different things that can affect those rights and make it so that they're not able to have those rights anymore. Like they need to understand before. I mean, I don't think that like people convicted of felons are really thinking about that at the time of what they're doing, but they do have to understand that taking certain actions are going to affect a lot of those rights. And I'm also not saying that they can't be reformed. Like, I think there is a lot of time for change and growth, but I think it's important to have time after after they've come out of jail for. I mean, it depends on the situation, I guess, but I think allowing for time to just like kind of reflect is necessary to just make sure that they're kind of right in the right headspace and they're back to being trustworthy. And although voting is one of the most fundamental rights of citizens, these felons have taken an action which they should know will affect them in a variety of ways. So it's again true that voting is a right for like all citizens over 18, but we also again know that this right can be taken away from us under certain circumstances. And as I stated earlier, I can agree that we want these people to kind of like re-engage with society, but they do have to be properly rehabilitated and show how they have better, they have like bettered their personal growth before that. I think it is best to require voter registration information and understand the situation before automatically allowing the felons the right to vote, because each person's situation is obviously different, but I think it is important to kind of look at the background and see how they have grown or have not. So yeah, it would just be necessary to truly see if they have succeeded with self-improvement and won't commit crimes in the future. So going through a formal process to earn back rights would be necessary there. I also find it hard to accept the fact that we can ignore that what these individuals have done is wrong and unjust. Even when people have served their sentence, it's not, at some points, it's not really fair to allow felons such as those to like the extent of murder to be able to vote for judges and have a say in how governments spend their money, for example. But rather than for them to focus on themselves and focus on getting back to a better state of mind, I guess. I had an example of like we have the right to drive a car, but obviously people take harmful actions like getting DUIs or other violations, which can cause them to lose their right to drive a car. And we have to understand again like why this is wrong and what we need to do to change this. I believe that the arguments provided for not allowing felons to have the right to vote are strong and revolve around the rights that you must earn and maintain. And again, if you can't follow the laws in your own life, why should you be trusted to help make laws for everyone else, at least with a certain amount of time to um, allow for personal growth, I guess. That's it.
Cool, thank you. So to just summarize my side, bottom line is felons are people too. They are citizens of the United States, and the Voting Rights Act was to get voting rights for all citizens. If felons did the time, then why is it so wrong for them to vote? At the end of the day, every vote should count. People who are not felons can be untrustworthy than actual felons. People can be pretty terrible people and not see a day in jail or prison and can still vote. Just because someone got caught making mistakes does not always mean that they're bad people. Which I know I'm not saying you said they're bad people. Bad people can have a perfect record and not see a day in jail and still be able to vote. Also, if felons were so trustworthy, why let them out of prison? Like I just said earlier, just summarizing. Why give them all these rights except voting? Um, I believe that at the end of the day, just showing compassion to human beings might change. Like I know that sounds kind of cliche and like, we should do more, but it really does affect how people think. A majority of the people who are classified as felons made mistakes when they were young or even as a young adult. We learn at a young age that people make mistakes and are some more than others and some more major than others. People who are classified as felons deserve a chance back into society. The more we exclude them, the more they will lash out and go back to their criminal ways. Give them a chance to be a part of something. Most felons convict crimes because they're neglected or lashing out. If we just show compassion for everyone, maybe it would be a better place.